Good morning. Thank you for joining me on this Good Friday morning during this interesting year of 2020 for a History at Home lesson. Today we're going to discuss leadership lessons of the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862. So let me begin to set the scene for you there a little bit. Fredericksburg is one that is remembered as a tremendous one-sided Confederate victory in that terrible war between the North and the South. And when we study history, we do it to, at least I think that we do it to understand people a little bit better and to pick up lessons that can apply to our own lives. So here at the Relic Room, it's our privilege, really, to preserve and to pass along South Carolina's military history. The virtual representation you see behind me of the Relic Room, you can't come in and visit today, but when you can, I hope that you do. We are South Carolina's oldest and I think finest military museum. And we've been doing our job since 1896, and at least one of the characters we speak about today interacted directly with the Relic Room. But if history is about understanding people, then I submit to you that, oh, I have some more admissions to make. Come on in, folks, and welcome aboard. If history is about understanding people, then military history is about understanding people under stress. And that is something that I think each of us can benefit from. So I call today's lessons Leadership Lessons of Fredericksburg. One thing that's a little different with the military and other professions. If you become a surgeon, you'll have to do a lot of studying and you'll have to keep current with your profession. But at no point will you be required to write papers on how surgery was done 400 years ago. That might be your hobby, but it's not relevant to how you do surgery today. If you become a football team quarterback, it's an unusual coach who has you write papers on great football teams of 1946. But if you were to become a military officer, you're going to find yourself doing papers about history. And not because the tactics you'll be using in 2020 have a lot to do with how a battle was fought in 1750, 1862, but rather because the brain inside a bronze helmet from ancient times or a modern Kevlar helmet or a flight helmet is the same brain. Leadership, human nature do not change. So today's leadership lessons happen at a battle in December of 1862. Again, Confederate fortunes are at a high point at this point in the war. And the fight takes place at a place called Fredericksburg. At Fredericksburg, the Southern Army is entirely on the defensive, and the Union is going to assault a very strong defensive position. Now, it had been calculated back then by military theorists that you ought to have an advantage of 4 or 5 to 1 before you go on the offense against a fortified position. The defense has definite advantages, and they're definitely going to come into play in the story of the fight at Fredericksburg. You're seeing here a map of the battlefield that I borrowed for purposes of this lecture. The red indicate Confederate lines here along Marye's Heights. And over here on the Confederate right flank, where a lot of our action is going to be happening today, really at both places here. And what you may not be able to see too clearly, that this running through here is the Rappahannock River. And the river has got to be crossed in order for assaults to be made by the Union Army. And the Union Army that day is being commanded by Ambrose Burnside. He's one of two Union generals who's given us a word we still use in the language from his last name. Burnside's impressive mutton chops there lent their name to the term sideburns. So Elvis Presley, for one, had a lot that he owed to the legacy of Ambrose Burnside. By the way, the other Union general who left us a word from his last name, still in common usage, that would be Fighting Joe Hooker, but that's a story for another time. Now, what's going on in December of 1862 with Ambrose Burnside is concern for his job. The Union Army has not been faring well, and Burnside's been put in charge in order to win a victory, to go out and do something aggressive that makes a difference. That's going to affect his judgment, many military historians think, in choosing to attack at Fredericksburg at all. It's getting late in the year. The seasons, the weather have a lot to do with campaigning. And here in December of 1862, he's really got one more chance to fight a battle and win a victory, to push forward against the Southern Army that has such a strong reputation, and perhaps to keep his job. And concerns for being retained in command are going to kind of push him forward, and a lot of historians think warp his judgment a little bit. Because, again, the position at Fredericksburg is very strong. You look here, if you look here at the map, you see we've got hills here. Wherever you've got a river, you can expect you've got high ground on both sides and low ground in between. So the Confederate forces have dug in along the high ground here on Marye's Heights, and also hold the high ground along the ridge all the way. Basically, the Union has got to cross low ground, and not just low ground, but low ground where artillery has already been laid in. The cannons based on the heights can sweep the battlefield, the potential battlefield, and it's a place where if they attack, they're going to take huge losses. In fact, Lee's artillery commander that morning had told him, "Sir, I do not believe that they will attack here. We cover that ground so well now, a chicken could not live on that field once we open fire." Perhaps this is Lee's hope, that the position is so strong that the enemy will not attack at this spot. Lee is the one who said that a commander has two ways he can contribute in slaughter and maneuver. The more he contributes in maneuver, says Lee, in getting the better position, that is, the less he demands in slaughter. You get the better position, and you're not going to have such a bloodletting, unless the enemy ignores the fact that your position is so superior and attacks anyway. And that's going to happen here at Fredericksburg. So Burnside is pushing forward, and we're going to look at his overall battle plan in just a second. But first, here's an image from the park of one of the most famous spots at the Battle of Fredericksburg, the sunken road and the stone wall on Marye's Heights. Now remember, that's over on the Confederate left. As you look north across the Rappahannock River, that would be on the left side of the Southern forces. And the stone wall was a really good defensive position. So not only did you have artillery on the heights sweeping the field, but you had soldiers with rifled muskets who had the protection of a stone wall. So that's an extremely formidable position, especially when your only choice is to move straight forward at it. And here's another view. As the attacker, if you can think about, you're a federal soldier moving forward toward a stone wall with men behind it who've got cover. You can only see their arms and heads and rifles as they pop up to take aimed, accurate shots at you, as well as artillery on the heights above them that can fire over the heads of the defender and into you. This is a nearly suicidal attack. General Longstreet assured Lee, in the case of attack, he put it very frankly, I will kill them all before they reach my line. Later, he would write admiringly of the bravery of the enemy at that battle. Federals had fallen like dripping rain from the eaves of a house. The charges had been desperate and bloody, but utterly hopeless. I thought as I saw the Federals come again and again to their death, that they deserved success if courage and daring could entitle soldiers to victory. Burnside's plan, he does have one. It's not simply a matter of bashing away at a strong Confederate position, although that's how the movies sort of remember it, and the events along the wall at Mary's Heights are the best remembered of the battle. But he does have a plan. And whenever you look at a military plan, there are a couple of ways that the Army teaches for factors to evaluate. But the quickest one is simply a two-factor evaluation of the plan that I heard in a lecture from a Marine officer years ago. And this Leatherneck said, when you're looking at a battle plan, look for what is the holding element and the hitting element. You got part of the Army that's trying to lock the enemy into position so that another part of your force can whack it from another side. And that is actually what Burnside is trying to do here. All right. Let's back up one. The holding element is supposed to be here. Those men who are bravely assaulting and are going to charge time after time against that stone wall and those hills, they're supposed to be keeping Confederate attention and formation faced toward them, because the hitting element is supposed to be these guys. They're supposed to break through on the Confederate right, and if they can break through, they can roll up these defenses from the other side. In fact, trapping the defenders against the river and delivering the Union a decisive victory. So the whole reason these guys are attacking here is so these guys can break through on the Confederate right, the Union left. That is supposed to be the hitting element in the plan. And see, here's a map from the National Park Service of that same area. And it says right here, Union breakthrough at Prospect Hill. Well, now we'll get to the first of our three leadership examples we're going to be talking about today, at least our not counting Burnside. Burnside is nobody's favorite leadership example, I don't think. But I'm going to talk about three men who were at very different levels of command decisions they made that day and maybe some lessons that can be pulled out. And the first one I'm speaking about is Brigadier General Maxie Gregg of Columbia, South Carolina. Now, Gregg is a fascinating guy. Not nearly as well remembered as some others of his rank. Gregg is a genuine eccentric. Brigadier General Maxie Gregg was not a career soldier. If you had visited Columbia, South Carolina sometime in the 1850s, and as you approach this city, you cross over the canal. And if you saw a man in business clothes walking along that canal, studying intently the terrain about him, with a dueling pistol, that man would have been Maxie Gregg. Maxie Gregg's dueling pistol was loaded with something smaller than bird shot. It was something called mustard seed or dust shot. And what Gregg is doing down there in the canal is collecting specimens. He's a natural history, a natural science fan, and he regularly collects specimens of small animals and birds and brings them to the taxidermist, donates them to the university, contributes to the scholarship on animals of all sorts around Columbia and the Carolinas. If you happen to go in the general store and there's a man there who has come in order to use the produce scales because he's keeping track of his weight in a journal, that man is Maxie Gregg. If that night you look up into the heavens and you're near the State House and you see that there's one house near the State House, not that impressive of a home, a middle-class home, but on top of that middle-class house, you see a telescope looking up at the stars and taking star sights. That too is Maxie Gregg. He's an intellectual. He's a brilliant and very difficult man. Maxie Gregg never lost an argument in his life. He also never got married. I speculate that those two things were closely related. Gregg has been advocating by the time of South Carolina's secession in 1860. He's been advocating for secession for more than a quarter century. He very much wants South Carolina to be independent. In fact, he's a little disappointed that any other states also secede and join the Confederacy. His dream is a republic based on something like the Greek or Roman republics that he has studied. And another thing about Gregg's character, unusually for men of his class and time and region especially, Maxie Gregg is not a fan of formal religion. He became turned off to it perhaps in his teen years. At South Carolina College, he sort of fell under the spell of a political radical and freethinker or atheist by the name of Dr. Thomas Cooper, the head of the faculty at the time, and the man USC's library is named after today. And Gregg instead seems to guide his life by the principles of some philosophers he discovered in college, or maybe a little earlier. The Romans called the Stoics. And this is going to have an effect on his character and on his decision-making. So to return to our battle, General Gregg's troops have a tremendous reputation. They are considered an elite brigade. He's commanding 4 regiments of South Carolinians that day. The 12th, 13th, and 14th South Carolina, as well as South Carolina 1st Rifles. And Gregg's troops have done their job very well in preceding engagements, especially at 2nd Manassas. At one point at 2nd Manassas, he receives order from A.P. Hill And A.P. Hill is a man he admires very much and gets along with well, but this particular order rubs him wrong. Hill sends Maxie Gregg a reminder, essentially, that his part of the battlefield is essential. And he says to him, it is essential that you hold your ground. Gregg gets his back up about that a little bit. Gregg doesn't like the implication that there's any doubt he will hold his ground. He answers A.P. Hill at 2nd Manassas, "We are running out of ammunition." But there remains the bayonet. South Carolina will hold. And up and down that line he walks, giving one of those speeches that only works for a particular kind of men in particular situations. It's a Scots wha hey kind of speech. Maxie Gregg walks up and down the line of his men with his sword drawn, saying, "Men, this is the spot. We will all die here. We will all be found dead on this line." Well, it is an inspirational talk. The men do hold their line. Gregg becomes a legend. They're not found dead along that line because a flank attack, they're the holding element this time, the hitting element strikes the Union and rolls the Union lines up. Gregg's brigade has done its job, and Gregg's military star is on the rise. So at the time of Fredericksburg, he's probably marked for future promotion as soon as a job comes open. But his men have been placed in a position for once where they're supposed to get a little rest. They are not this time on the front line. They are back here held in reserve. And it was often said that the general who could keep his reserves from being committed the longest stood in good chance to win the battle. And these reserve troops, the idea is they're sort of the fire brigade. If the Union is able to break through, it's going to be the reserve troops who are sent in to stop up the leak. And something about the Confederate plan, Lee obviously thinks if the leak happens, it's going to happen over somewhere on his right. This area is just too strong. And of course, you can see that this is marked Union breakthrough. That is indeed where the leak happens. Gregg's men are someplace back here, and they've been placed in reserve. They are not the front line. In fact, their weapons are stacked. What they don't know is that the two units in front of them in this woods right here, the green area, two units have failed to link up with each other. Two Confederate units have made a mistake and left a gap in between them. And when the Union forces, as you can see from battle plan here, the Union forces who are headed this way hit that line, they find a gap and they begin pouring through. This is what Burnside intends. This is where the breakthrough is supposed to happen that rolls up the Confederate lines. But in his way are Maxie Gregg's reserve soldiers. Well, Gregg sees the men in blue begin pouring through the trees, but blue and gray weren't as easy to distinguish as we sometimes think. And his men begin to seize their rifles, which have been stacked, and to fire on the men who are coming toward them. But Gregg has a terrible, morbid fear of friendly fire incidents. He really wants to prevent those, and for good reason. They were a deadly danger during the war. And Gregg reasons that if men are coming out of the woods, first he's going to see retreating Confederates before he sees any Union troops. It only makes sense. So when his men begin firing on the men coming out of the woods, Gregg stands in front of them waving his saber to say, "Cease fire, cease fire." He believes they are accidentally firing on retreating Confederates because those will appear long before any advancing Federals. Because of the gap in the woods, that's not what has happened. And so this is the spot at Fredericksburg where General Maxie Gregg is mortally wounded. He clings to a tree or Some accounts say a fence post, but they can't find where the fence was, so I think it was a tree. And Gregg is waving his men forward with the saber, the last many of them see of him, waving them forward into a counterattack against what he's realized is definitely Union troops because they've shot him. Gregg's men are going to save the day at Fredericksburg. They prevent that breakthrough from happening. They ruin Burnside's career by doing so. And the hitting element is now gone from the Union plan. But that holding element, the assaults on the wall, they've gotten close enough to the wall a couple of times that it's too encouraging. And the men can continue assaulting the wall at Marye's Heights. This is where we get to a man at a very different level of command. General Gregg is commanding a full brigade. Richard Kirkland is a non-commissioned officer. He's a sergeant in the 2nd South Carolina. And Kirkland is behind the stone wall at Marye's Heights. And he's doing his job. You look closely here, you'll see non-commissioned officer rank in this photograph of him. And the defenders at that wall, they're in a very advantageous position, and there are even more men than there is wall, so that there are a couple of men deep in a lot of places, and the men in back are simply reloading muskets and passing them to the men in front, so that a very high rate of fire is kept up. And many Confederates, not just Longstreet that I quoted earlier, are going to express their admiration for the bravery of the Union soldiers who continue the assault at Marye's Heights. But Kirkland goes further than that expression of admiration. Now, I'll say right now, there is a debate out there over the accuracy of the stories of Richard Kirkland's heroism that day at Marye's Heights. But it's a debate of fairly recent origin. And I come down on the traditional side, that the stories about Kirkland that day, of course, there are always changes from memory, and there may be exaggerations here and there, but essentially the story I'm about to tell you actually happened that day. Kirkland, a very religious man, and a good non-commissioned leader. In fact, he's going to die in action the next year at the Battle of Chickamauga. But Richard Kirkland, engaged in battle that day, sees the Union make their hopeless attacks and sees many men left behind in a hopeless condition. And as the wounded and the dead have piled up, it's particularly the wounded the following night who become really sort of prey on Kirkland's conscience. And Kirkland is going to realize that these men have nobody that can help them from their own side, that they cannot be recovered. And Kirkland is going to go to the brigade commander, Kershaw, and make a very unusual request. Now, the Southern Army often had men in it who, although their differences in rank were huge, they were acquaintances from back home. And Kirkland actually knew General Kershaw. So, you know, as an E5, I never went to see the general to make a request. That's not how it works. But Sergeant Kirkland did. He went to Kershaw, and according to Kershaw's account, Sergeant Kirkland came to him to request to, as the battle had begun again, that he should gather up canteens and go over the wall to try to assist the enemy wounded. And Kershaw considered this request of Kirkland's, and he told him, "Don't you understand, you're going to get killed?" And Kirkland said he understood the danger. And according to Kershaw, he said to him, "Sergeant, I should deny your request. I shouldn't let you do this. But I won't be the guy who said no to such a noble request. So if you want to do this, you can do it. I cannot raise a white flag for a ceasefire. We think the enemy will take advantage of that. We're not going to stop this battle. if you want to help, despite the fact that you're going to be under fire, go ahead. And the accounts say that that is what Richard Kirkland did, that he gathered up canteens from his comrades and that he jumped over that stone wall to get to the enemy wounded who couldn't be reached safely by their own side. And as he first went over the wall, remember, the Federals didn't have a lot of targets, and now they had one. And not only did they have a target, but their immediate suspicion was that he was going out among the dead and wounded to loot, that he was a sort of a bold ghoul who was after pocket watches, money, or whatever else he could find out there. So apparently a lot of shots were directed in his, were set in his direction as he began his errand of mercy. However, the firing soon ceased as it was realized what he was doing as he stopped to give water and comfort to enemy soldiers. And you can see a statue to Richard Kirkland today at the National Civil War Museum, as well as a beautiful giant painting of him at the South Carolina State House, offering aid and comfort to the wounded and now harmless enemy. And he would go down in history by the nickname, a nickname he never heard in his own lifetime, the Angel of Mary's Heights. There we have the Richard Kirkland monument here. At the risk of his life, this American soldier of sublime compassion brought water to his wounded foes. The inscription begins there. And one of the important things about Kirkland is going to be his legacy after the war. He's a man who dies at Chickamauga. And yet after the war, it was vital to the nation, to anyone who wanted to see some kind of reunification. It was vital that there be men who could be looked back on by both sides with admiration and respect. And Richard Kirkland, through the stories of his acts of compassion at Mary's Heights in the middle of that bloody Battle of Fredericksburg, that's going to be his legacy. So we see leadership at one of the top levels at brigade command. We see leadership at the non-commissioned officer level. And particularly for Kirkland, not simply compassion, humanity, courage, but initiative. I don't think Kirkland was the only man who noticed what he noticed, or even who had the impulse to do something about it. But Richard Kirkland is going to be the guy who steps forward to actually do it, who takes it up the chain of command, and then who takes a deep breath and vaults over that wall. So, brigade command, certainly a high level of command. In those days, still a frontline job. At Gettysburg, for instance, 1/3 of Confederate privates were wounded or killed. 1/3 of Confederate brigadier generals were killed because commanding a brigade was still a frontline job at that point, with enormous responsibilities. The non-commissioned officer has his own responsibilities. The last man we're going to look at today had a rank so low that fortunately it no longer exists. In fact, it's difficult for us to exactly envision. The last guy we're going to look at today as a leadership model is a man with no formal authority. At least I think we're going to look at him. There we go. This is a post-war photograph in the uniform, probably of the governor's guards, a uniform of a post-war South Carolina militia unit, of a man named William Rose. And William Rose had possibly no uniform at all, but certainly not a uniform that fine on that day at Fredericksburg. His name first came to my attention through one of Maxie Gregg's artifacts. We'll get to that shortly. But William Rose's rank in the Army was non-existent. William Rose was actually a slave. He was an army musician, or at least that was how he had set out to war. And Rose was a man with a lot of campaigning experience. In 1862, this was his third war. The first time that William Rose went to war, he was a 12-year-old drummer boy, and he left Columbia with the Richland Rifle Company to engage in the Second Seminole War down in the Everglades in Florida, a deeply frustrating and horrifying conflict to the men involved. But for William Rose, this was the kickoff to what was actually going to be a long and low-profile military career. By the time of the Mexican War in the late 1840s, William Rose, still serving as a military musician, but also was elevated to what they would call an officer's body servant, which is something like a valet. In the British Army, they would have called it a batman, and it was usually a retired non-commissioned officer who took that sort of servant job as a paid gig for the British Army. Of course, William Rose is still a slave. This is not a paid position for him, but he leaves for the Mexican War, accompanying the Palmetto Regiment, and is actually the body servant to the colonel, who is killed. And the stories that circulate around the state afterwards about him have to do with his amazing exploit. William Rose, apparently alone, with a pass written out by the Army that said, please give this man every assistance as he carries out his mission, William Rose would bring the body of the colonel home from Mexico City to Charleston, South Carolina. We don't know what resources he used or what routes he took, but it must have been an amazing odyssey for a lone slave with a casket who managed to get the man's body back to his family for burial in Charleston, and for the story to be bandied about South Carolina that this was the greatest camp servant of all time. Well, when secession occurs, before the war, in 1860, when secession occurs, once more William Rose becomes a military musician. He leaves with the militia unit, as he always has in the past. His master doesn't. Rose went off to the coast of South Carolina by himself, or not by himself, but not accompanied by the man who held the paperwork that said that he owned William Rose. And he would then travel with Maxie Gregg's new regiment up to Virginia when they were sent up there. And Maxie Gregg was not a wealthy man, but sort of upper middle class. He was a lawyer. He had brought a slave with him to war, a servant by the name of Pleasant Good. But Pleasant Good was an older man. He did not appreciate the rigors of campaigning. They were unpleasant and not good. And so Maxie Gregg sent him home to Columbia and elevated one of the musicians, William Rose, basically to his valet position. Now, he didn't purchase William Rose. At no time was Maxie Gregg William Rose's owner. Rather, he literally leased the man. And of all the 19th century things, it's hard for us to imagine. Can you imagine doing lease paperwork on a human being? But that's exactly what happened. And apparently the two men became quite close. They were of an age. Rose had seen a lot more campaigning than Gregg had. Gregg had been in the Mexican War, but only in a non-combat role behind the lines. And apparently the two men became quite close. When Gregg was mortally wounded at Fredericksburg, then it was William Rose who moved on to the battlefield and carried him off. Maybe not a new experience for him. Military musicians often acted as stretcher bearers, and he might have done this in the Mexican War. He may even have done it at some point in the Seminole War. But he took Gregg off of the battlefield and brought him to the hospital. The wound was obviously mortal. The bullet was lodged near the spine. And it was either William Rose or another slave around the camp who was sent on an errand that no one expected. And it's interesting to note that many positions done by slaves or sometimes freedmen in the Confederate Army are positions that might be done by an enlisted man or even a non-commissioned officer today. Not sure who's adding those arrows. It's not me. Oh, and there they go. We're all still learning this program, folks. So William is doing a job that would be done maybe by a senior non-commissioned officer retired in the British Army. And in modern armies, many of these jobs that were done by slaves or freedmen in the Confederate Army are handled either by civilian contractors, enlisted men, non-commissioned officers, or even warrant officers. But all of those people have authority that goes with their job. William had no authority whatsoever. One of these men was sent to go get Stonewall Jackson. Now, this was a surprise because Gregg and Jackson did not get along. So for Gregg on his deathbed to request to see Stonewall Jackson was a big surprise to everybody. And this incident is portrayed in the film Gods and Generals. They get it totally wrong. They're extrapolating from a single source. I don't blame them for that. Whenever you see history on screen, my rule of thumb is treat any history on video as a commercial for good history books. That includes me on video, by the way. But the film Gods and Generals shows a final meeting between Stonewall Jackson and Maxie Gregg, and sort of invents a conversation that the screenwriters thought the two men might have had. Apparently they were unaware there are records of what actually happened that day, including an account by William Rose himself. And what did happen that day, when Jackson came into the tent, Maxie Gregg said to him, General, I sent you a letter last week, and I have since learned that you were right about that matter and I was wrong, and I will not die with an unresolved quarrel on my conscience. Well, Gregg is acting like a perfect stoic. One of his last thoughts here on his deathbed is that he wants to leave life honorably and having fulfilled all of his obligations, all of his duties. A Victorian man like Gregg, an upper-class Victorian man, an educated Victorian man, is going to think about potential last words if he's going into a deadly situation. Last words were a thing. And his official last words, he sent a telegram to the governor of South Carolina. I yield my life cheerfully for the independence of South Carolina. That's one more little dig. That's one more little nudge toward Gregg's extreme political view. He's fighting not for the independence of the South, but his own preference would be the independence of his state, South Carolina. But he has other things to resolve in these final hours as well, and he's determined to resolve them. One of them is his quarrel, we don't know what it was, with Stonewall Jackson. The movie suggests the quarrel was about religion. Almost certainly not. Although Jackson was very religious and Gregg wasn't, the real tension between the two had to do with the tension between Jackson and A.P. Hill. Jackson and A.P. Hill didn't get along. Gregg and A.P. Hill were very close, and Gregg was an admirer of his and a partisan of his in the Army ranks, and this is probably what it had to do with. In any case, though, when Jackson heard, I will not die with an unresolved quarrel, Jackson's response was, General Gregg, the doctors tell me you will not be with us for long, and we have no quarrel that's of any importance now. There are more important things of which we must speak. Well, the ensuing conversation apparently was quite long and ended, unlike the film, with Maxie Gregg's religious conversion. He wrote home to his sisters that he had, to their great surprise, by the way, that he had made his peace with God and that he would see them in heaven after all. And a lot of folks would say, well, chalk one up for the great Stonewall Jackson, who made this conversion in Maxie Gregg's last hours. But that's not really the way I see it. If someone had an effect on Jackson during his Army career that made him reconsider his long-held, firm religious views, I don't think it was a general that he didn't like very much that made him think twice. I'm going to take a wild guess that it was the man who was cooking his breakfast, cleaning his gear, and in many ways being the closest person in this eccentric introvert's life. And part of my evidence for that is the artifact that kicked me off on my Maxie Gregg research in the first place, his gold watch, which is in our collection, on display. I'm sorry, we borrowed it from the Kissick Museum, but it's on display in the Confederate Relic Room's main gallery. It is a beautiful gold watch, and it's engraved. And the engraving inside the watch says, "The dying gift of General Maxie Gregg to his faithful servant, William Rose, Fredericksburg, Virginia, 1862. Well, the letter home to his sisters, the one that tells of his religious conversion, this letter also says, my gold watch is to go to the man who's carrying you this letter. His name is William Rose. Ironically, William Rose is a member of the same church that Maxie Gregg's sisters attend, First Pres here in Columbia, South Carolina. And I believe it's the sisters who have the watch engraved so that no one can take it from him. As a black man with a gold watch, he's at risk of being accused of battlefield looting or any number of things, of losing that item. But now it's engraved, it can't be taken from him, and he will carry that for the rest of his life. So a leadership lesson there is the enormous amount of influence that a man might have through his own character, who has no formal authority at all. Another leadership lesson, I think, is that of the three men I'm talking about today, one of them had a post-war legacy. And that was William Rose, a living post-war legacy as a man who became a minister, unsurprisingly, a man who regularly addressed Confederate veterans' reunions as an invited speaker, and was a leader in his own community, being one of the founding elders of Ladson Presbyterian Church right after the war. So a long life full of hardship and 3 combat campaign tours with no credit gained from them, bringing 2 dead officers, dead masters, in a sense, home from the war for burial. And yet his legacy at the end of that war as a man in his mid-40s was something that was still going to go on for a long time. He's going to be part of political events in South Carolina. He becomes part of Wade Hampton. He's a Wade Hampton appointee in 1877 to work at the State House, and he will work at the State House until almost the turn of the century. There are newspaper accounts and newspaper interviews with him all the way into the 1890s. And it was said in 1898, he was still an active member of the South Carolina militia and considered by that time to be a staff officer. And a newspaper account said he had to be physically restrained from getting onto the train to go off to the Spanish-American War in 1898. When he died in 1901, this was a pretty major event for the state. In fact, thousands of people gathered for the funeral, and newspaper accounts said it was one of the most unusual combination of white and black mourners, because of his military career and his long legacy. Half of his pallbearers were elders from his church. The other half were Confederate veterans wearing reunion uniforms. And William Rose, because of his long life of diligent work, William Rose could often act as a bridge of communication between two groups that were split apart pretty severely in South Carolina. So, leadership lessons. I think there are things to be learned from each of these men and some encouragement perhaps to be taken and some warnings as well based on how their character and their decisions affected events that day at Fredericksburg and events and patterns far beyond the battle. One final leadership lesson from Fredericksburg, though, if you'll remember Ambrose Burnside and his mighty sideburns. Jot this one down too. Never bring a mustache to a beard fight. Okay, folks, thank you all for joining me, and I know I went on for almost an hour today. Anybody got any questions at this point?